Right?
Right on.
I think we're on.
Oh, great. Yeah. Is this thing on? Uh, Welcome to Public Lab's Open Hour. It's January 11th, and I'm Liz. I'm here in Brooklyn. We also have Stevie down in New Orleans, and then we have 4 excellent presenters with us tonight. Our theme is reflections on 21, and I'm going to pass it straight to our presenters to begin their introductions and start us off on this topic. So, Monique?
Hi, this is awesome to be here. My name is Monique Verdin, and I am a multidisciplinary artist. I've been doing work here in the Mississippi River Delta for many years now. My father's people are from the Homa Nation, and I went to Paris for COP21. I was a delegate with Indigenous Rising, and that is through the Indigenous Environmental Network, worked on their media team, and also was able to share a documentary film that my collaborators and I released a while back, but still very relevant to the conversation of climate, My Louisiana Love. And yeah, I was not what I expected at all, but I guess we'll get into that more later. It's good to be here.
Great. Nick?
Hello. I'm Nick Shapiro. In addition to hanging out with Public Lab, I'm also a research fellow at something called the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia. And I am also collaborate on this project called the Aero Scene with this artist, Tomas Saraceno. And so it was with Tomas that I went to COP21. I was part of the COP21 Solutions conference and exhibit, and also part of the Art COP21 happenings that are sort of distributed around the city.
Okay, great.
All right.
Let's see. Willie?
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Willie Schubert. I'm here in California. New place for me. Just moved here. Very excited. I am a member of the Earth Journalism Network. We're a global community of environmental reporters, and as part of the climate negotiations, my role was to support a group of about 40 environmental reporters from 25 different countries to attend the summit and to kind of help reporting, help them report back in their local outlets. And I'm part of the Public Lab as a organizer who works on the Dustuino project, and yeah, that's me.
Great. Dorn?
Great. Thanks, Liz. Great to be here. I'm here in New Hampshire, about an hour north of Boston, and I'm with FarmHack and the PharmOS project. But my relationship with the Paris talks, I was not there, but I'm here to represent some of the others in the group that did attend through the Open Agriculture Learning series, which is a group of organizations and individuals that are developing open source tools for regenerative agriculture, particularly environmental monitoring and modeling tools. So I'm going to be talking primarily from the debrief that I got from Amanda Ravenhill with Project Drawdown, and her focus is primarily on regenerative agriculture's role in both mitigating and adapting to climate change. So looking forward to sharing her notes, and I'm really excited that Public Lab is convening the debrief. I think it's exciting to get this group of folks together to coordinate, because I think that's one of the important outcomes is combining our networks.
Awesome.
Agreed. Let me read a sentence from Tristan, who is not here, and I don't look anything like him, but I know him as a documentary filmmaker who's part of Public Lab, and he writes that he attended for the final 2 days of the conference as a participant of POC 21, which was an open source innovation camp which took place over summer 2015 to develop open, sustainable lifestyle products. All right, I have a little bit more from what he wrote into us on the second round. So I'd like to go ask the participants, again, same order, Monique, Nick, Willie, Van Dorn, to share a further statement on what motivated them or the organizations they're a part of to send them to Paris, and what some of your goals were. Monique?
I'm muting myself. Okay.
Okay,
yeah.
you're good.
Okay. So, you know, I wasn't planning on going to Paris until in the spring of 2015 to Homa women that I've been working with to raise awareness about the environmental issues here in South Louisiana. The past principal chief of the United Homa Nation, Brenda Dardar Robichaud, and Clarice Frilou, who lives next to these toxic waste pits in Grand Bois, which is just south of Homa. And so we were at this conference, and they said, we're going to Paris. And I said, okay, well, I'm going too. And then because of circumstance, they weren't able to go. And I had already bought my ticket. And then I met the Indigenous Environmental Network, specifically Dallas Goldtooth and Clayton Thomas Muller, who is with 350. He is the Keep It in the Ground organizer right now. And so they were here in Louisiana for the 10-year anniversary of Katrina. And I connected with them, and they invited me to be part of the media team. And, you know, my experience would have been so different if I wouldn't have connected with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And, you know, even though it's sad to say that, you know, every person in the network that I kept meeting and would hear their story, it sounded so similar to our own story, you know, the Homa story here in South Louisiana, just with a different mask on it. And in that, you know, it's there was this kind of, okay, we're all in this boat together. And not that that makes me feel good that so many people are facing, you know, climate chaos, really, but also to see that there is strength in people standing up, and very much so on a grassroots level, and specifically Indigenous women who are, you know, in the Amazon and are fighting extractive industries. You know, the women who are in Alberta fighting the tar sands, those in North Dakota with fracking. You know, it was really powerful to just connect with them and to really expand the kind of the spectrum. You know, we're all kind of in our whole fighting our own little individual fight, but you know, really seeing the interconnectedness of it all was really eye-opening for me in a way that I know in theory, but I really experienced that in a way that I just, yeah, it moved me so emotionally that I you know, and I couldn't. It was hard to kind of control all of these emotions, and just really, I think what was most powerful is being with people and real people. You know, that the suits were inside the blue zone, or you know, wherever you had to, where you had to have credentials, but outside, and not even at Le Bourget where the conference was happening, but in the streets and at other alternative events. You know, that all over the world showed up to say, hey, you know, we're all in this together. So, yeah. And you know, it was great to share, you know, the Homa perspective and to represent, you know, what's happening here in the Mississippi River Delta, because I feel that, yeah, you know, we have disaster after disaster, and we're in the limelight, and then it goes away, and it's an ongoing fight. So, and we here in the Gulf of Mexico or along the Gulf of Mexico, also recognizing that we are a carbon bomb for the planet, which I hadn't really seen in that way before going to Paris, and just speaking with other people and being like, okay, yeah, what's being extracted here is also affecting these women from the Arctic who are now having to migrate to other grounds, which is similar to what's happening here in the Delta. So, yeah.
Wow, thank you. Nick.
Can I ask Monique a question? Is that messing with our order?
Yeah, but you can mess with it.
Oh, okay. Well, I was wondering if are there avenues of communication that are now established, or that you're going to be creating an ongoing lines of communication, or fight, or struggle, or organizing, or was it just like the moment of being all there together that was just powerful enough to sustain a lot of the work that you're all doing separately?
I think that, yeah, I think it's growing. I think it's already been happening. I definitely feel that, that moment in Paris for a lot of people kind of sent this surge of, okay, how do we support each other, and how do we stay connected, and how do we continue this conversation and make it as loud as we can. I don't know what will come of all of it. Yeah, and I think that lots of people are trying to sort that out too, to keep that momentum moving forward.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. I don't feel like I have anything interesting to say after that.
That's not true.
I don't know. I guess I can explain briefly what I was doing there. So with Public Lab, a lot of the time we are focused on very specific issues. We are trying to get information into the hands of into people's hands that normally they have an idea of what the problem is already. They're experiencing it. They're seeing sickness or pollution in their environment, and we want to we have an epistemological goal. We have a knowledge goal of getting information about the environment to help people better live their lives or save their local ecologies. And so I love that work, and I do a lot of that work, but this project that was sent me there was sort of a different ilk. It's not about monitoring the environment or knowing the environment better in any sort of technological capacity, but it's about building solar balloons as a alternative form of transportation, and also an alternative sort of temporality and speed of time. So as Matthew can attest, solar balloons are the least reliable form of travel. So if you travel by solar balloon, you have to pay attention to the weather, you have to pay attention to the wind and the sun and their oscillations in a very intense way that sort of attunes you to elemental forces, and forces you to slow certain trajectories and reorganize the logistics of your life. It's no longer about engineering through hydrocarbon extraction like cars or planes or hot air balloons, where you engineer around, you overcome nature, but you how do you move with it? How do you use the sun and the wind as an infrastructure? So it was a very unwieldy project. It involves the French Space Agency, Thomas Sarcenos at the head, and researchers at MIT, people from all over, mostly North America and Europe, collaborating on this project. So it was great to. I mean, one of the largest reasons that we all went there were just to see each other, sort of like the barn raising, and we had. Oh, I guess Tomas had these giant sculptures hanging over in the Grand Palais, hanging over the entire exhibition of. So the COP21 Solutions building in the Grand Palais was very controversial for a lot of reasons. Largely, it was sponsored by a lot of polluting entities. It was sort of seen as a venue of greenwashing, Um, and so, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. But it was sort of controversial. It was also, you know, after the terror attacks, the security was very high. A lot of people were getting kicked out, and even people within our installation or I guess within Tomas's installation in the Grand Palais, even some of them got arrested and taken away at various times. So it was a high security event, but it was really nice. It was like this floating critique of reformism and of greenwashed like environmental tools. So there are all these like green cars scattered all over the Grand Palais, and then sort of if you look horizontally, all you see is the same stuff that populates our lives normally, but green. But then if you look up, there's this really bizarre orb that flies based upon the sun and the wind, and it was a really nice like it was nice to be like sort of menacing all of the like reformist technologies on the ground floor, and yeah, it was pretty amazing. There had to be someone there at all times adjusting the pressure inside the balloon, because the Grand Palais is an arcade, so it's all glass. So the balloon just wanted to Willy Wonka itself, the ceiling, and there was someone in the rafters changing the pressure. And then he came down to go to the bathroom and was arrested. So that was sort of the context of that. That's what I was doing. Oh, so I was at the Grand Palais, and then also there's this big day-long symposium at Palais de Tokyo, which is sort of the it's the city contemporary art museum. It's sort of overshadowed by a lot of things, like the Pompidou Center has more money, so Palais de Tokyo has been a little bit neglected. It's sort of nice to be in this quasi-bunker of a place, and the power wasn't working, and all sorts of fun stuff. But thanks.
Right on. So I'll go up next, and again, my role there was to bring journalists and media. We've been planning for this quite a long time, kind of the opposite of Monique a little bit. We've been working towards bringing this group of journalists for almost a year, and again, the job, what brought us there, the motivation was to get news out via outlets, the non-mainstream ones. So I felt today it might be useful to go through kind of what happened for the audience today, like what actually occurred in the Blue Zone. So the Blue Zone is where all the negotiations happened, all the world leaders go there, and getting accreditation, as I'm sure many of you who are in Paris can attest to, is really hard. So bringing in 40 people from all over the world to kind of monitor what was going on from all the different country delegations and see what the different negotiating positions were. So I'd like to quickly just go through a few of those. I have a screen share ready. It should be this one. Okay. All right, I've got a. I think we're there. Yeah, we're looking at ourselves.
Yeah, we see
Right.
your
Okay.
now.
So yes, this is the website, the Earth Journalism Network website. So those 40 journalists were publishing stories from all their different outlets, about 150 during the course of the 2 weeks, from all these different groups. So what did the Greenpeace director have to say? What does South Africa have to say? What are the issues related to health from Samoa? So my job was to kind of sit in the middle of all these journalists and make sense and start publishing all of these things. And what was the mainstream reaction to this climate summit? It's like, here's the New York Times coverage. And I think the mainstream reaction was, at least they agreed to something. Like, this is a landmark deal because there is a deal at all. There was a tremendous amount of disappointment after Copenhagen in 2009, where there was no deal. And this was the narrative of this event for quite a long time, was that there would be something happening here, and in the context of the terror attacks, there was a lot of joy and jubilation inside the conference itself about the fact that any kind of agreement could happen at all. So in the meantime, I'm working with all of these journalists from developing countries. So like, here's one other example of a site like this on the third poll, coming from an Indian and Chinese perspective. And basically it's looking at this and saying a lot of the core issues like loss and damage are not necessarily being covered. There's not a lot of specifics in this grant. So from this developing country perspective, in this treaty, the details of how it will happen aren't necessarily clear. And that was something that was noted quite a bit by, here's James Hansen, who he's considered he was a NASA scientist, a climatologist, who basically during the events came out at a press conference with a lot of other scientists as well, calling the agreement a fraud, that it's all promises and that it's not really scientifically possible to achieve this. So that was, definitely a reality check that we should all be thinking about as well. So in terms of, is it a glass half empty, glass half full? Meantime, as Monique was talking about Indigenous rising on the outside, what's going on in the streets, you have, lots of people demonstrating, essentially saying, we're not being included, we're not being recognized in this, Indigenous people explicitly saying we're not being recognized, and they said, this is the actual quote right here, the Paris Accord is a trade agreement and nothing more. It promises to privatize, commodify, and sell forested lands as carbon offsets in fraudulent schemes such as Red Plus projects. And I think we'll be posting a lot of these links there after. And so this is an article that was written by a Philippines journalist who's been going to a lot of these climate negotiations. Her name's Imelda Abanyo. She's a member of our network. And so she's taking a look at this and saying, well, what's actually in? Well, the deal that was made was essentially that we have a legally binding framework that everyone is going to agree to, that we will submit our commitments, and that is legally binding, and there will be a transparency system and a price of carbon which says we will be measuring this equally across all nations, and that we all have a common responsibility to respond. However, the commitments themselves are not legally binding, just the process. So that's why this thing has been called the end of the beginning of the negotiation period, and that there's supposed to be growing ambition and systems to increase ambition over time, but you have issues like that were brought up by indigenous groups, and also groups seeking finance for things like loss and damage as a result of climate change, who now no longer have a legal right to seek compensation for damage. And this was brought up in the first response at the plenary by Nicaragua, who said, how can you believe in human rights when you're limiting the legal rights of our children to seek restitution for the damages being done by the most responsible? So our job at this event, what brought us there, was to bring the voice of the most vulnerable people and places to the event. And so we launched a series of e-magazines about different places. This one's about sea level rise. We also did one on the Arctic and on desertification. We also published a live blog every day of what was going on, and from all these different journalists, what was this like history, this background text as it's happening. And we also launched a site called OpenHour, which is, if you're familiar with our work at all, we build these geojournalism websites that bring together media to talk about issues like the Amazon with Info Amazonia. And so we've brought all of these stories into a common platform that's now organized by topic, region, and time, so that environmental news can now be streamed from all these different places in near real time to kind of catch up with data. And lastly, because I know I've been speaking probably a little too long, today so what's next is the big question. And today we're launching these climate grants for adaptation and response. So these are grants for networks of journalists or communicators to pursue projects that are cataloging or supporting ways people are adapting or responding or monitoring that response to climate change. Because again, this is the idea behind this is that this is the beginning, the end of the beginning. And so what's really key at this moment is to be monitoring and following up on what the commitments are, because there are universal frameworks for transparency built into this system. And how we participate in that is an open question, especially in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, which the UN is also launching in 2015 as the SDGs, the replacement of the Millennium Development Goals. And these are designed to be data-driven and designed to be measurable impact, like to measure impacts on how things like air quality or environmental health or climate change are financed and accounted for and funded. And so how we as communicators, as scientists, as activists can contribute to that kind of a system, I think is one of the key questions, because this framework has created a system. And it's at the very beginning, so that means there are opportunities to mold it, to participate in it, to try and change it potentially, or subvert it if necessary, I guess, depending on your flavor. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Willie. Thorn?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Very inspiring work bringing together that level of coordination. I think that's something that other areas, it's the kind of thing that we envision for scientific research and citizen science. But that it's very inspiring. Thank you. So I'm going to walk through a little bit because, as I mentioned, I was not there, but I do represent a network that was represented there. So I'm going to walk through a little bit about how that network came to be, and then also how we're working together. Because part of the reason that we were present there was to expand and to find points of find common objectives and areas of overlap that don't always follow traditional disciplinary lines. So, as I mentioned, Amanda Ravenhill is with Project Drawdown, and the reason that I know and work with her is because we've worked on a project called the Open Agriculture Learning series. And I'm going to walk through just a couple quick websites that show the different organizations. So can you all see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's good.
So the Open Ag Learning Series came out of a dialogue at a State of the Soil meeting in California about a year ago. And it brought together activists and scientists and NGOs to begin a conversation about what can we, what is the state and what are we going to do? And it was a little bit of a precursor heading towards Paris. Now this group is really, as you may have guessed, it's about regenerative agriculture, and regenerative meaning that we're looking at agriculture as a method for balancing our climate, and in fact, the state of the atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions right now are essentially an indication of an out of balance system, and that the role of agriculture is to rebalance that system and put the carbon in particular back into the soil where it's actually productive. And this group came out especially focused on democratizing the knowledge about that process, and also environmental monitoring tools, which is very much in line with the public lab mission as far as democratizing scientific inquiry and putting the best tools into the hands of those who can actually take action with them. if you go to the archive presentations, we've begun having conversations with each of these groups to explore in more depth. And some of you public lab folks may recognize the R.J. Steinert's Open Pipe Kit, but it's also Carbon Nation, Field to Market Public Laboratory. Jeff did a presentation for us. The Center for Open Science, and trying to bring together everything from on the ground, like PhotoSync has on the ground plant health monitoring tools, trying to build a citizen network to do a global plant health monitoring system. And then we have other organizations like Comet Farm, which are developing global agricultural climate models. And there's a big disconnect between in each of these systems that needs to be bridged, and it's too big a project for any individual organization or government or nonprofit or for-profit to really tackle. So it has to be done through cooperative agreements. And so Amanda went under the guise of Project Drawdown, and their goal is to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions on a year-to-year basis, but her interaction with us, they look at the wide spectrum of all the possibilities and trying to bring them together in a meaningful fashion. Very ambitious project. But our interaction is really on the regenerative agricultural piece of it, and that was the focus of my conversation with her. And I think a big part of her focus while she was there was to connect with other organizations working in a similar vein. And so they were focused. A couple of those were Regeneration International and Kiss the Soil is another. And the general outcome from this perspective, this idea that agriculture can be part of the solution, was really reflected and recognized for the first time in the climate talks this year, which was very exciting to this community, with especially through the French the French initiative called 4 per 1,000, which is which gained which had a day-long workshop focused around this, and was officially recognized within the programming. So, and this is the basic idea is that 4 per 1,000 is that 4% increase in carbon sequestration in the soil would compensate for annual CO2 anthropogenic emissions. So it's really pointing towards a productive outcome of a win-win situation. And so, and it wasn't that long ago that this was just not really even on the table for being discussed. So it was rather exciting, again, as I mentioned, for this community to be able to see soil on the Eiffel Tower as part of the solution, and to be recognized, again, as part of the primary solution, starting on December 1st. So I guess the outcome from Amanda's perspective was that it was it wasn't wildly successful from a regenerative agriculture's perspective as far as being at the table, but moderately successful and excellent in creating stronger networks and creating a way forward to assure that our voice is heard at the next talks. And we had some favorable coverage on NPR that I thought did a fairly good job explaining the carbon farming approach. So the next steps that we're looking at. Let me see if I can shut off screen share. Am I back? The next steps that that we're really looking at are continuing to map our network, not just the tools, but build what has been more networks that have been within national boundaries, and try to link up where there's common objectives, common problem statements, common infrastructure and platforms as well. So in particular, it's Kiss the Ground and Regeneration International are look like they'll be key partners. Also mapping farmers themselves, and that's where the FarmOS platform that we've been building through as one of the FarmHack projects really comes in, and which is also playing a larger role in the national soil health initiatives that are just taking hold here in this country. So again, the 4 per thousand is still the biggest headline, and it's a finally serious policy coming from from the French government in particular. Project Drawdown is going to be following up directly in partnership agreements with the French government. And in general, it sounded like the ecological solutions to carbon capture were the hot items of discussion, which again was exciting. One of the things that that Amanda mentioned that was significant, that may be easily overlooked, was the inclusion in Article 4 of not just reductions in emissions, but the capacity of sinks to equal our emissions during and actually setting out the goal of having sinks match emissions by mid-century. And so that's a pretty significant thing. That's an area where we can actually actively take action. But one of the big hurdles is, of course, and why we know folks like Bill McKibben have not wanted to take on the possibility of carbon sinks, because of the danger of giving people a positive option to offset growths in emissions, and giving an excuse to not take steps towards reduction of emissions as well. But I think that needs to be, the possibility should not be ignored. I think it's time to look at it directly, and I think the democratization of that process, and it is a process that that works best at the local level, focusing because each acre of soil, each quarter acre of soil is vastly different and requires special attention. So it is something that scales with people, and I think that's where it really overlaps with the kinds of tools that we're talking about with the public lab community and the FarmHack community. So that's really the big outcome that we're seeing, again, is the expansion of the network, and then talking with groups like this to look at common platforms that can enhance our capacity, our individual capacity for collective action, and leverage each other's efforts, and democratize the process of global knowledge exchange. And I guess I see the other goal really as coming closer to recognizing that increasing soil carbon and creating a healthy climate as a shared human value. And I think we're much closer to that. So I think that's pretty exciting. And well, I guess the other piece of that is not just the productive soils as a shared human objective, but that we also have a right to understand the environmental system around us and what's affecting it. So I think that's another unifying factor: open source tools for observation, analysis, action, and communication. So.
Thank you, Dorn. I just want to add in that yet another part of the event at an activist space called Center Court. Tristan was there with a showcase. He said there was an amazing array of organizations and events, but part of being there meant being pulled in too many different directions to really experience any of it in detail. He said that it seemed like there was a great presence for open tech here, and that the public who were attending at least this part of the event, the Center Court activist space, were generally super receptive. Okay, short statement from Tristan there. I want to open the floor now for anyone to ask anyone else a question. And if you'd like, we can turn to the questions we asked ahead of time, but we can just start with it wide open right now.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, this is Scott at Propeller in New Orleans with the crew. I had a question, I guess for Monique, for anybody, but Monique brought it up, was the term climate bomb. I know a little bit about what that term means, but could you clarify, or could anyone describe the analysis behind, what is a climate bomb? The agricultural issues that were this climate bomb analysis.
Carbon bomb, you mean?
Carbon bomb, excuse me.
Which is different from a car bomb.
Don't say that.
Well, I think I got that term from you, Scott. Just that we are, because of the extraction, because of the production, and the refining that's happening here in the Gulf of Mexico, that our progress is putting out a tremendous amount of carbon. But maybe one of the scientists would be able to explain this better.
Well, if Willie posted a link, but you kicked it back to me. If I said that, I was specifically referring to a 2013 analysis that was commissioned by Greenpeace and done by a research firm, EcoFys, on 14 industrial projects. So it wasn't considering all of the loss of forest canopy and loss of soils that are contributing to climate change and greenhouse gases. It's more about the industrial projects that would increase carbon emissions to the atmosphere by 2020. The Gulf of Mexico offshore, out of those 14, ranked about number 8 or 9. There's things like increasing coal consumption in China, Australian coal, industrial endeavors have.
Hold on, Scott.
The Gulf of Mexico was about the 9th ranking. Go ahead.
Yes, actually, could you repeat that last sentence? The internet gave up on you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, this was just a specific analysis about 14 different projects. The Gulf of Mexico offshore drilling effort being one of them that would contribute a lot of increased carbon emissions by 2020. I believe this now that shore would contribute 350 megatons by 2020, where some other analysis has said we only really have megatons left by 2050 before we put so much carbon in the atmosphere that we to self.
I think I can clarify a little bit as well. If you're we good?
Go ahead, Willie.
All right. So, from my understanding of like this discussion about the carbon budget, so there's an analysis that's done every year called the Global Carbon Budget, done by an NGO in the EU, and they put out an analysis as part of this, as part of COP21. They announced that there was a peak, like that the carbon emissions for one of the first times there's been maybe a pause, so that the total amount of greenhouse gas that's being emitted is not growing exponentially anymore. That it's actually had it's leveled. It's leveled. And we don't know if that will last for a long time, but the concept of these like tipping points or carbon bombs or have a lot to do with some of these natural processes, like one example being permafrost. So when permafrost melts, it releases a tremendous amount of methane. Like there's also a huge amount of methane being emitted right now in Southern California due to a leak because of fracking, which is having an appreciable impact on California's greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon, but methane specifically. And that there are some things that go beyond our understanding and that are not necessarily human caused but are triggered, such as these massive amounts of methane trapped in the Siberian permafrost. Whereas if there was a mass melting there, it's essentially, I mean, this is a doomsday scenario, but it's game over for humanity. I mean, that's like the real downside of these types of things, is that that's really what's at stake here in this whole carbon budgeting concept, is that there are some things naturally occurring that go way beyond our ability to control for them, and should they occur, well, that's just it.
Just to kind of continue the conversation, though, is like, you know, in March, they're getting ready to auction off 43 million acres of deep water territory in the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at, you know, the kind of extraction that's happening off the coast of, you know, California, or, you know, nothing's happening in the Arctic now. The Atlantic, people are fighting that pretty hard, but there's a push, you know. But here we are, you know, in America, and I think that, you know, for the Deep South specifically, you know, Louisiana, you know, we are the, how do you say it? We are the global South and the global North, and that we, you know, the U.S. just signed this agreement, which, you know, is voluntary and not binding in a lot of ways and blah, blah, but, you know, it's just business as usual here. So I think that, you know, in coming home, and that's just like one of many of the things on the list that are like, you know, opposite of what the agreement is like kind of trying to be. You know, how do we as community, local community, try to push forward a new vision and try to push forward this kind of just transition that is desperately needed? Yeah, I just, you know, it seems absurd that like, oh, we had the Gulf of, you know, the BP drilling disaster and, you know, months of oil spilling in the Gulf of Mexico, but we're going into deeper water and we're going into new territories and we're expanding as rapidly as we can. You know, how do we put the brakes on that?
Monique, can I ask you a follow-up question that's actually the question you wrote? It's your first question. Excluding the rights of indigenous peoples from doctrine to declaration. And then you've got this interesting phrase. I'm wondering, could you share this phrase with us and say a little more about what you mean?
What's the phrase? I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the list.
Well, let's see if I pronounce it right. From colonialism to...
Oh, from colonialism to CO2. CO2 colonialism. Well, you know, I mean, I think I think that you know, I've been doing a lot of research about the Homa, and you know, this summer I was invited to participate in this workshop in DC called From Doctrine to Declaration. So the United Nations, not that long ago, signed this, the rights of indigenous people. The doctrine of discovery is a 500-year-old doctrine that was released by, you know, the Pope back in the day, who said, okay, you can, you know, go forth and conquer the world in the name of God and country. Just make sure that, you know, the savages, they can be your slaves, but they, you know, make them Christian too. And this is the foundation for so much international, well, all international policy to this day is built upon, you know, this doctrine. And even though there is in the United Nations this Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, you know, that's often not taken into consideration. And, you know, the Red Plus is a perfect example of that. You know, that now we have these carbon sinks, and they're, you know, indigenous people who are being thrown off of their land so that big government and big corporations are allowed to continue business as usual. And I just think that, you know, for, you know, one of the big things when we were in Paris early on in the negotiations was Article 2, and that the rights of indigenous peoples was taken out of the binding agreement. Yes, it is included in the preamble, but that's not binding. So, you know, and indigenous people were not part of the, you know, they were observers. Like, they got credential, you know, some were able to have credentials to go inside, but simply as observers, people who were signing this document. And, you know, so much of these lands, especially with the carbon sinks, are in indigenous territories. And also, you know, nationwide, I think that, you know, just kind of going back to this conversation about how these federal territories here in the Gulf of Mexico are being auctioned off. You know, there's a lot of BLM lands that are right near many indigenous communities that are also, you know, dealing and trying to fight fracking and other kinds of fossil fuel mining. So. You know, this is just it was cotton, it was cane, you know, it's oil and gas.
Great. I'd like to, well, did anyone else respond to this question, this topic? Otherwise, I'd like to go to Nick's question. Okay, great. Well, it's all on the table. So I'm reading from something Nick wrote. Quote, the Solutions Conference was very depressing. It served as a boilerplate of self-congratulations from some of the biggest polluters. You know, moving right along on the theme of disappointment, I wanted to go here next. Nick, you did allude to some of these things. Do you want to give us any more information about how you left, why you left feeling this way?
No. I think I sort of covered it earlier in terms of how the Grand Palais was sort of the manifestation, like the big manifestation of COP's presence in the city. The Grand Palais is this sort of architectural gem, like a symbol of French imperialism, and it was in this place that all of the green technologies that were going to fuel the solutions for whatever the politicians would decide, those were all being sort of displayed at the Grand Palais. And yeah, they were all sort of based upon maintaining a similar level of consumption. And they all sort of, there's always that question in carbon neutral technologies of when do you start counting? And how do you, so probably none of them are carbon neutral in any way. Maybe the use of them is carbon neutral, even though the manufacture of them is based upon extraction on maybe indigenous lands in Australia or conflict minerals in Africa. So, yeah. So yeah, it was pretty depressing, and I think I guess one of the questions I had written in advance was sort of in response, like what are the ways, I think there's always an interest in the legal frameworks that come out of these conventions. How can we hold them accountable to the flimsy thing that they created up to make them not accountable? So we're gonna hold you to that. You're gonna give us some pressure points to hold you on. But what are the ways in which we can look to? The question would be, what are the ways we can look to alternative ways of making a world that we want to live in that don't necessarily involve playing by the rules that the people that are in power are making for us. And so that was sort of part of the idea of the project that I was working on, is not how do we monitor how bad the world is, but let's start not at the nightmare but at the dream. And how do we start aloft in some like fantastical place and work to get there. And so that's sort of why I was thinking about this with the provocative nature and the ways of thinking and acting otherwise that don't necessarily. You love quoting me, Liz. She said the quote in the text. So yeah, that was my main question. Is I'm often skeptical of like eco art and things like that, but this to me felt like it felt like something worth trying and experimenting with. Whereas the legal recourse, is dismal. I actually have a question for Willie, just to interrupt myself in my ramble. But the what you said about there's no longer legal rights to seek restitution. I was wondering if you'd tell us more about that. Is it that intergovernmentally there's no longer an ability to have? So if, let's say, there's a corporation based in America, someone in Bangladesh can't sue. Is that it?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, that was one of the reasons why this was viewed as a big win by developed nation in terms of some of the things that were agreed upon. That in exchange for this framework of having at least a universal agreement, there were some very real negotiating positions. Like there were daily changes in the text, and I mean that's kind of what happens at this thing. There are real perspectives being shared from different groups, and what this signaled to me, like this change, this legal liability. So that was one of the things that was kind of similar to the Trans-Pacific Partnership via the treaty, saying, this is no longer, like, that's not the mechanism. The courts are not the mechanism for seeking restitution. The Clean Development Mechanism and the Green Climate Fund and adaptation are the focal points, not compensation for loss and damage, which has been a major sticking point between developed and developing nations. And to me, what this is a signal of, this is a personal opinion, is that this climate agreement is the signal that the paradigm of developed and developing countries is over. That there's universal responsibility.
Willie, can you repeat that? The paradigm what?
Of developed and developing is over. That there is not a differentiation between the responsibility. There's a universal requirement to respond, to at least participate in a process of responding. Whether that is agreeing, there's no binding to what level of ambition you have. But as part of that deal to get a framework, it means that the courts are no longer the venue, the battle point for seeking compensation. It's through development finance. However, Kumi Naidu of Greenpeace was explicit in saying that they will not stop their attempts to sue governments for responsibility for, say, Bangladesh. And this is what some members of the Bangladesh delegation were telling me, that, you know, loss and damage and compensation for impacts that are already happening are not being discussed here, and that there's an attempt to table them until the next discussion in Morocco, in Marrakesh, this year. And so I think that a lot of what we can do as a community is document the ways that people are responding that are outside of these frameworks for large-scale development finance, which lead to a lot of these big projects that have implications for indigenous people that are not being recognized, enshrined in the international law, to document that, to share that, and to legitimize that as a response. Maybe it's not in the jargon of the climate summit, but that is a legitimate response. We are taking it and bringing it together, organizing it, demonstrating it, showing it, and then bringing it up for Marrakesh, because that's when the next fight. I mean, it's the end of the beginning. There is a framework to do something. Are you going to keep participating? I mean, that's I think that gets to the heart of your question, Nick. Is there a value in participating? Well, yes and no. There's a value in the legitimizing force that it has, which is, I think, what Dorn was talking about. I'm sorry, I think I misspelled you. Yeah, what Dorn was talking about in terms of legitimization. But the way to get legitimization is to just keep doing what you want to do. Keep doing what you need to do to respond to the issue, and then seek collective ways to institutionalize to the best of your ability. Because without it, yeah, I don't know, you just have melting permafrost in Siberia.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. I really appreciate that point. I think there's so much. I think that was a theme too, is that there's so much we can do without the bureaucratic approach, with direct action and direct communication, and that we'll make progress regardless. And these are things, a lot of the things that we need to do to adapt and mitigate and to improve social justice and our own livelihoods are the same things that will also move us in the right direction. And and a lot of this stuff we don't have to ask permission for. We can just move forward and show the viability of this. And I guess what I came away with from folks who were there is that approach is working. It's getting recognized at some level. Is that the people in Brazil who are practicing regenerative practice, it's working. It's reducing inputs. It's increasing profitability. It's being disseminated globally. People are picking up on it, and that's a powerful process.
Right.
And it's not an easy thing to stop.
And there was a very clear example in this negotiation where, you know, things happen at these events. Like, one of the small things that happened, small, in the big picture, was that Dilma Rousseff signed an executive order to put hydropower plants on indigenous territories in Brazil. Like, that had been legislatively disallowed, and she just said, all right, well, if we're going to respond to climate change, we need low carbon energy, and we have this block to it, which is hydropower plants in indigenous territories. So we're just going to do it. And there were networks of indigenous people who got that information out incredibly quickly and mobilized a response to that plan. I mean, for separate reasons, but for reasons nonetheless, during the climate negotiation, Dilma Rousseff was served with a impeachment letter from the vice president of Brazil during the climate negotiation. things happen. Things happen. Yeah.
I want to jump in for a second here. New Orleans has been listening, and I just wanted to send thanks to everybody who shows up and had so much to contribute for all of us who couldn't be there. And thank you for sharing all of that with us. So I know we reached the hour, and I want to carry on the conversation, but before anyone jumped off, there were like 10 of us around that were just like, all ears. We lost you heard it here with that internet, but just thanks. Okay, carry on.
Monique, not to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you wanted to respond to anything that Lily was just bringing up. You don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really let me back up. Okay, so I heard a really incredible activist, Ananda Lee Ken, say that, you know, the role of artists is to make the climate movement irresistible. And I really love the quote from Nick, let's start not at the nightmare, but at the dream. And, you know, I've really been trying to kind of spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, how is it that we move this forward in a healthy and beautiful way, and that there are these solutions that we can, you know, as everyday people in our own communities start to try to integrate, and that from those small steps there can be revolutionary change. I think one thing that I did want to offer before we all part ways is that on March 23rd, here in New Orleans, when the Gulf of Mexico deepwater territories will be auctioned off, there is a plan for an action, a march, and the Indigenous Environmental Network will hopefully be part of that. There's some organizations locally along the Gulf Coast, and also we're connecting with national groups too, just to say, hey, you know, we're 3 months post-Paris, and here we are in the U.S., and this is continuing. So the big dream is to circle the Superdome. It's a lot of people that are needed, but if there's more information out there, we're calling it the new lease on life. Because yeah, we need one. So yeah, and I mean, I really think it's about inspiring and celebrating what is good, and believing in the dream and making that a reality. So yeah, I mean, with all the doom and gloom and carbon bomb and, you know, end of the world if we don't get our shit together, you know, it's you know, I think that there is hope, and it really is. It's through relationships and networks and sharing tools that we can all have access to, that can be integrated into our solutions.
Fantastic. That almost sounded like a great concluding statement. Doesn't have to be, but perhaps we could go in order, our same order, and you don't have to conclude. You could ask another question if you want, but I just want to hear from everybody before we reach the end of our time together. That means Nick is up.
I guess whenever I have time, I just ask Willie another question, so I'm just going to do that. I mean, that statement that the paradigm of developed and developing countries is over is really fascinating. So I wasn't sure exactly what you meant. Did you mean?
Right.
That,
so.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I'll let you.
So in the past, there had been this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. That there was a difference between China's emissions and America's, because there's the context of developments. The most famous example is the Chinese negotiator saying, our emissions are bus emissions and your emissions are SUV emissions. There's just more of us, is why we have higher emissions, but like, so that's a fundamental disconnect, and we are not going to be able to agree. There's also, in the past, there had been this negotiating position where Saudi Arabia and Nepal are on the same team as developing with like the G77, and there's conflicts of interest around that. And so what this agreement brings together is a universal framework saying everybody at a national level especially, that's where decisions will be made, at the national level, and we're all equals here. We all are going to agree to this process, and this is it. This is the process. And we'll figure out the other issues later about loss and damage. We'll figure out the other issues about finance as we go forward. But so when I'm saying that this developed versus developing paradigm, they were saying, you know, well, India has the right to emit because of their developing, and they, you know, these kind of concepts in terms of the right to pollute, and being based upon that conception that there is a developed and a developing. But that argument is now seriously undermined at an international level, because there is an international agreement for a process. That's what I meant. It's not to say that that will disappear from the way, like from terminology, but in terms of a paradigm for how the world is organized, it's much less important.
What do you think the political ramifications? I mean, I already asked my question. I don't want to eat up too much time.
The political ramifications of that? I mean,
do you feel like, I mean, probably developing countries weren't so happy about that.
Well, because China and India are taking a different negotiating position, and India is saying we want $2 trillion to adapt, and they're saying, okay, well then if we're all going to play the same game, we're accounting that we need 2.5 trillion. It's no longer billion, it's trillion. So we're going to up the level of ambition in terms of money, especially private sector finance, because the whole thing is based, like, I would really encourage reading this article from this woman from the Philippines, Imelda Abano, because it makes it pretty clear, like, the key components of the negotiation in terms of how are you going to pay for it, and the role of climate finance and the role of private sector in changing it from B billion to T trillion dollars in amount. But I think that there's a change in the relationship between people like the U.S. and China at the core of that shift, and that played out in the run-up to the negotiation where China and America made deals about a carbon trading scheme before Paris even happened.
Could you put that article in the chat, or maybe you already have?
I can. Yeah, I'll put a few.
Thank you.
Yeah, could you type her name?
Yeah. Yeah, so she writes for one of the largest dailies in the Philippines and is a mentor in the network for local journalists, especially young journalists in the Philippines. And she's been to, I think, like 10 of these COPs. And what she said at the beginning of this whole thing is that if you even can figure out 1% of what's going on here, you've done a good job, because they're insane. These things are insane.
Have any more questions, Nick?
Well, I had a question, and again, it's too big, and I guess I was going to point it at Willie because you've been so good at answering questions. But how does then that square up or not square up with the just transition ideas. I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to. Is
Yeah.
the financing agreement still based on some of these ideas about that the countries and companies maybe that have been polluting since 1850 financing things, or
Yeah, I think they're certainly trying to get out of their liability. I mean, that's for sure. Like, in terms of the avenue for how that justice is served. I mean, this is a bit, again, a personal opinion, I would say. But, I mean, the response, if you go back to look at the framework, the very first country that responded at the plenary was Nicaragua. After they gavelled in the deal. And I think that response is really telling. And I would look to that in terms of their response from a political and a developing country perspective. I would look at some of the scientists, the scientific perspective about the difference between a politically negotiated settlement with which this agreement was a success and the scientific reality of what it is capable of achieving and the level of ambition to actually achieve justice. I think it goes back to balancing those different groups. I mean, you can see what the scientists have to say about the reality of is justice being served. You can go back and look at this response from Nicaragua and from Indigenous Rising about served for whom. I think that those are the key voices to answer that question. I don't feel qualified to answer it myself.
Great. Well, Will, you've been answering a lot of questions, but if we go through our little order, you would be up now.
I guess I'll just plug the grants, the call for grants about adaptation and response. So this year we're making available about $220,000 across 3 or 4 grant calls for applications. The first one was just announced today. There will be one about innovative approaches to adaptation and response. That will be coming out in the next month or so, a month or two, and then there'll be a series of story grants throughout the year about various elements of response. So I would just say keep looking at the Earth Journalism website, especially the opportunities section, because yeah, I mean it's an interesting time to start doing projects together, because I think it can have a big, long-lasting impact at a moment of transition.
Great. So those grants are to work with Earth Journalism Network. Am I understanding that right?
So they're grants that are from us. It's to do your own work, ostensibly. They're project ideas that get funded as part of the work. So like an example of like one of the innovation grants that we're working on this year is about OpenAQ, the Open Air Quality Project, which is scraping all of the official air quality monitoring sources into a common database. Like that was a grant where we provided support to do a training in Mongolia. They were already working, but we said, oh, would you bring this idea to a place that needs it a lot? It can be an example like FarmHack if you want to document some of your approaches and share them, or hold a workshop where there's travel involved, or you know, I mean, we're open to a lot of different ideas. It just has to be in some way connected to climate change and adaptation. And that can be a variety of, and response being a more broad way to define adaptation.
Fantastic.
They average $15,000.
Fantastic. Let's see. Well, Doran, you did just get a shout out from Willie, and you are up.
Great. Yeah. I guess I just like to close with just the hope for more direct action, and that as much as we're all responsible for the problem, we're also the solution. And I think that productive action is something that everybody can take part in, especially when it comes to being involved in recarbonizing the soil. My friend Courtney White, who was also there, took that picture of the Eiffel Tower, wrote a book called The 2% Solution, which is basically that 2% organic matter increase would take about 2% of the population and only about 2% of the global GDP. So this is totally attainable. And I guess I'd like to just leave with that message, and it's not something, again, that is technologically out of bounds. It's something that the Earth has been doing for billions of years. It's really a matter of us coordinating our efforts and sharing knowledge. It's not about, and shifting our mindset from a world of scarcity and extraction to one where we're thinking about abundance. If we think about what we need to tackle this, it's carbon, nitrogen, and water, which there's certainly plenty of, and most of it's in the atmosphere and in the commons. What we need is more access to knowledge, which is the limiting resource, connections to other people, which requires connections to other people, and access to land. So it's land rights. So that's where we do bump up to bureaucratic action, is getting access, getting people access to the land and access to information and access to each other. So, but I really appreciate being part of this forum and all of your insights moving in that direction, and embracing I also wanted to reflect and really appreciate this. How do we make the idea of how do we make this movement irresistible? I really appreciate that, and how do we make it so that it's not sacrificing, but how do we make it creating a process of creating a better lives for ourselves? I think, yeah, Nick, you had a good statement in there. I've got to go back and catch that. What was it? Oh, yeah, let's start with a dream. Let's build our dream. So, thanks, Liz.
Sure. Typing quotes at all hours of the day. Yeah, so wrapping up, I also want to say I'm really inspired to talk to all of you guys who I know from working, in a collaborative, peer production kind of space, on the nitty-gritty, like new technologies and going outside with boots on. And then to hear from you all who have gone, at a global level to have, this level of discussion, and then report back and think how we can do what we're doing more effectively and more, I guess, inspiringly to draw more people to it. Anyways, I just really appreciate this group of people. And I know there's many more who couldn't join us as presenters, but who are also participating in these kinds of things. So we've gone way over our hour. We almost went to an hour and a half. So thank you, everybody. I think we can wrap this call unless all of you guys in New Orleans have anything else to shout out at us.
Happy birthday, Paul. That didn't come through.
Cheers, everyone.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey.
Bye. Thanks.
Dead air spots.
Let's see.
Look at those lights that are in there.
Oh. Did that entire